just start this recording. So all these, so those of you, I've had a couple of people subscribe already. So it takes a little while for me to upload these, but usually once we've finished, I can upload the presentations onto YouTube. So if you're subscribed to my site, you can kind of get there straight away. So rather than me sending out a link each day, which sometimes has to be kind of an hour or so after we've finished, you can always go there to kind of get the lesson. So let's crack on. So last time we did about the structure and function of the respiratory system. This is the presentation. I'm using the same presentation. I stuck a couple of different slides in just to add some questions for you, but I can send this out later on. But this is the same presentation format we did the other day. So we looked at a few of these bits. I'll just whiz that back. We talked a lot about the location of the lungs, and we talked about their just kind of almost just describing their location anatomically. So we were talking about how they sit behind the sternum. We're talking about how the heart sits between them. We're talking about how the ribs are either side, and the lungs just sit on top of the diaphragm as well, which is a muscle we'll talk about later on. We talked about the main function of the lungs. So ultimately it's about bringing oxygen in and getting carbon dioxide out. So getting carbon dioxide out is kind of to a large extent equally as important. So if carbon dioxide is allowed to accumulate in our body, our blood becomes quite acidic, and so when our blood's acidic, it makes lots of essential processes very difficult. So we can't break down fuel, proteins start to denature. It's a sort of an important thing for us to regulate. So to regulate that, we increase our breathing rate, which not only gets oxygen in, it gets that carbon dioxide out. We talked about the structure of lungs. We sort of looked very briefly at that nasal cavity, its function in warming, moistening and filtering air as it comes in. We looked at the sort of the passageway, the tubes that take air down to the point of gas exchange, which is the alveoli. So today we're going to look at the muscles involved in breathing. We've kind of mentioned a lot of them along the way, but it's useful to just sort of clarify. One of your questions is about the muscles involved in breathing. You're going to describe the passageway of air through the respiratory tract. That's another one of your tasks. And you're going to describe the process of gas exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. So you'll need a pen and a clear sheet of paper. So some of the tasks that we do as we go along, you'll be able to kind of replicate into your workbook almost immediately. So do make sure you do the tasks that I ask for. Let's go through here. So we kind of went through our various sections. So some of these pictures will be common. This is a sort of point we ended at last week. So we kind of we sort of described the structure of the lungs. And I was asking you to sort of expand your explanation here. So each one, so the nasal cavity is the entrance to the respiratory system. So we're talking about how it warms, moistens and filters. The pharynx is essentially a tube that leads to the trachea. This is the back of the throat, so it doesn't play a huge role in breathing other than just being a tube. We talked about the structure of the trachea. So the words I got you to use last time were here. So about it descends into the chest. It's made out of C-shaped rings of cartilage, and it divides at the bottom to form these bronchi. So the bronchi, two tubes, one either side, made out of rings of cartilage. And they narrow into the bronchioles, which get smaller and smaller, which are surrounded by smooth muscle, which allows them to constrict ever so slightly. So anyone who's got asthma will notice when the bronchioles constrict, it limits airflow into the lung. And they end at these alveoli, these sacs at the end of the bronchioles, where gas exchange takes place. So it's very thin. They've got all right. Apologies, something happened there. Right, back in the room. So suddenly I just dropped off. So I do apologise. Mid-flow. So here we are. So we got to the point talking about the alveoli, and we're just talking about how thin they were, and they were the point of gas exchange. So I think I'm going to just take you into the other room, just because my internet connection is showing signs of weakness. So as we do, I'm going to pose a couple of questions into the chat box. So whilst I get my stuff clear, I'm going to ask you to answer some questions for me in the chat box. So let me know you're with me, so I can see how many of you are here. So I want you to tell me the answer to this one: A, B, C, or D. What is the average lung volume for a man? I've got 4 options: 1 litre, 3 litres, 5 litres, or 8 litres. So give me some answers in there. Well done. Yeah, couple straight in straight away. So Cade and Ash, well done. Anyone else? Give me some answers. Yeah, good. Everyone's right so far. So 5 litres. Well done, everybody. Good stuff. So yeah, well done indeed. Okay, so this is the last next one. So how long is the trachea? How long is the trachea? Anyone? Oh, not so good with this one, I think. Not so good. 4. Couple of wrong answers coming in. Yeah, we got a right one after all. Yeah, well done. Good. So 12 centimeters is the length of the trachea. Yeah, again, just another conducting tube. Remember, it was those C-shaped rings of cartilage. So just behind, so the trachea's the cartilages are kind of shaped like that, and then down the back of it sits the esophagus. So when you eat the food you eat, sort of slides down a pipe that goes down the back of the trachea. So it sort of swells out slightly into that space. It's a sort of C shape, a little bit to have that tube behind it, if I can sort of emphasize there. So the C shape here allows the esophagus to kind of sit in there. I guess that C shape, the fact it's cartilage, means it stays open. It's a little bit less likely to be crushed. There might be a little bit of kind of give to it in a way. Yeah, the trachea is 12 centimeters. So I've asked you here, give me the surface area of the lungs is equivalent to which of these? So a table tennis table, a squash court, a tennis court, or a football pitch? What do we got? So yeah, we've got a couple of answers coming in. Anyone else? Table tennis table, squash court, tennis court, football pitch. Close. Yeah, it's a club. Okay, so it's actually a tennis court. So it's around 80 meters squared in total. So still quite an impressive amount if you think that that's the total area available for gas exchange. Covers the whole area of a tennis court. So it means that when you pack it inside that kind of 5 liter space, you can imagine how thin that substance needs to be. So when we sort of look at alveoli, they'll look like almost like little balloons in a way, but actually they must be so thin, so minute to be allowed to fit into that tiny space. So the total surface area of the lung is around 80 meters squared, which is around the same as a tennis court. So well done, all those who got it right. And then this question asks, how many alveoli are there in each lung? So related to the previous question in a way. How many alveoli have we got in each lung? Yeah, anyone else? Got one right answer coming in. I think it was for the right question. Anyone else? Come on, let's see what we got. Okay, so it's actually D, 250 million. So again, just a really interesting to kind of picture that, how you can picture, fit 250 million of anything into a space. About the, when you think about each lung is about 2.5 liters. You think that's kind of just slightly bigger than a Coke bottle. So 250 million little air sacs popped in there must be absolutely minute. So incredibly sort of small, incredibly sort of delicate structures. So let's have a look at what they look like and how we get air there. So this is a task that you'll be asked to do later on. So what I'd like you to do is just very quickly, so let's imagine we are describing the passageway of air through the respiratory tract. So obviously as we breathe in, it gets filtered through our external nose. So that's our start point. So all I want you to do is put in top external nose, and I want to note the order in which air will go through in order to get to your alveoli. Okay, so that should only take you a couple of minutes. So just have a look over this. You can use your notes if you wish. But first of all, just make sure you've written this down. And at the end, when we go through the answers, make sure you've written it down. Okay, so that's your job. Just a couple of minutes, get onto that. So what you've got on here, so what I'd like you to do is just make yourself a quick note just about what I've just talked through. So essentially what we're looking at here is two groups of muscle that we're interested in. So we've got the sternocleidomastoids up here, which lift the rib cage up, and we've got the external intercostals down here, which pulls the ribs out. So the key thing is all muscles involved in inspiration are responsible for increasing that chest size. So it means that you increase the chest size, you decrease the volume, you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. It allows air to be drawn into the lungs. So just make yourself a quick note there, and I'll clear that off whilst you do that. Okay, so hopefully you're pretty clear with that. Now this is a challenge. I'm going to try and get you to watch a video on the mechanisms of breathing. This is quite a nice one. It's only sort of 4 minutes long. Now what I need to do, I need to make sure I can share with you my sound, and I'm going to try and see if this works. So let's I'm just going to sort of open it up in another panel. Where's it gone? There we are. Okay, so
pulmonary ventilation, commonly referred to as breathing, is the process of air flowing in and out of the lungs during inspiration and expiration. The air movements are governed by the principles of gas laws. Basically, air flows from higher to lower pressure. Pressure within a cavity increases when its volume decreases, and vice versa. Volume of a given amount of gas increases with increased temperature. At rest, in between breaths, the pressure inside the lungs, or intrapulmonary pressure, equals the pressure outside of the body, or atmospheric pressure. When discussing respiratory pressures, this is generally referred to as a relative pressure of zero. This is because what matters is the difference between the two pressures, not their absolute values. Thus, a negative pressure is a pressure below atmospheric, while a positive pressure is above atmospheric. The lungs are covered in a double-layer membrane, which forms a thin space surrounding the lungs called the pleural cavity. The pressure within the pleural cavity, or intrapleural pressure, is normally negative. This negative pressure acts like a suction to keep the lungs inflated. If this becomes zero, such as in the case of pneumothorax, when the chest wall is punctured and the pleural cavity has the same pressure as the outside air, the lung would collapse. Pulmonary ventilation is achieved by rhythmically changing the volume of the thoracic cavity. During inspiration, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles contract, expanding the thoracic cavity and the lungs. This increase in volume results in a decrease in pressure, causing outside air to flow in. Another factor that helps to inflate the lungs is the warming of the inhaled air. This effect is most notable on a cool day when the temperature outside is significantly lower. The inhaled air increases in volume as it warms up inside the body and inflates the lungs, further facilitating inhalation. While inspiration requires muscular contraction and hence energy expenditure, expiration during quiet breathing is a passive process. As the diaphragm returns to its original position and the muscles relax, thoracic and lung volumes decrease and pressures increase, pushing air out of the lungs. Quiet expiration relies therefore on the elasticity of the lungs and ribcage, their ability to spring back to the original dimensions. Conditions that reduce pulmonary elasticity, such as emphysema, can cause difficulty exhaling. Deep breathing requires more forceful contractions of the diaphragm, intercostal muscles, and involves additional muscles to produce larger changes in the thoracic volume. Deep expiration, unlike quiet expiration, is an active process. Another factor that affects ventilation is the resistance to airflow, which exists within the lung tissues and in the airways. Lung compliance refers to the ease with which the lungs expand. Healthy lungs normally have high compliance, low resistance, like a thin balloon, easy to inflate. Lung compliance is reduced when the lungs become stiff, in conditions that cause scarring of tissues or fibrosis. In this case, the lung turns into a thick balloon, harder to inflate. Diseases that narrow the airways, such as asthma, increase resistance, making it harder to breathe. The airways may also dilate or constrict in response to various factors. For example, parasympathetic stimulation and histamine typically narrow the bronchioles, increase resistance.
Okay, so I'm just going to finish that there. I'll just bring this back in. Okay, so I think it's quite a nice picture, a nice little video, just to show the process of the gas pressure changes. So the little bit at the end I think was quite interesting. Was just talking about was just talking briefly about how sort of certain lung conditions change our ability to breathe. So when we look at things like asthma, certain diseases like I think like emphysema, it just increases the work of those respiratory muscles. It makes them have to contract much harder to be able to allow us to draw air in. So I think sometimes it's quite a nice one to look at. If you can't, if it didn't come through on your device, there's I'll sort of send the link over to you all later on. So just on that, so just in kind of a recap. Oh, is it blocking my PowerPoint now? So what's going on here? let me see. So I'm having a nightmare. There we are. Coming through okay? Okay, okay, glorious. Okay, so recap so far. So what I want you to look at is this. So let's think about which muscles are responsible for the following. So I'm just trying to give you a few kind of lead-in terms here. So which muscle is responsible for so it descends, the muscle descends to draw the lungs down and increase volume. So if we think about which of the muscles does that, which muscle does that? So this is the diaphragm. The next muscle which expands to lift up the chest cavity, which is responsible for expanding and lifting up the chest cavity. These are those external intercostal muscles. So the external intercostal muscles are responsible for expanding and lifting up the chest cavity. Which muscle is responsible for relaxing and allowing the lungs to rise and produce quiet exhalation? I'll put exhalation twice. I'll try and correct that in a short while. And then lastly, which muscles are responsible for contracting to reduce chest volume during that forced exhalation? So what I'd like you to do is to complete the task 2.4 and 2.5 in your workbook. So I'll put a couple of ideas in the chat box, words you can use, but I'd like you to start pressing on with that. Those two questions should only take you about 10 minutes. So if you can just start that now, and then we'll regroup in 10 minutes once you've done that, okay? So I'll just pop in chat box what you'll need to do. Okay, so there was on the top I've given just a little example of how you can address that if you like. Let me just clear that off now. Where's it gone? So I'll just clear that and we'll move on. So far you've explained the passage of air and the muscles involved in respiration. So we now just need to finish up gas exchange. And again, I'm going to give you a few minutes to go over that in a while. So let's just get to that point. So we kind of covered this a little bit the other day, actually. So this is about how oxygen diffuses from alveoli into the blood to be transported around the body. So essentially, we'll look at the structures in a minute, and I think it makes a little bit more sense. But we draw oxygen into the body. So oxygen in atmospheric air is under, it's a relatively high concentration. So atmospheric air around us is about 21% oxygen. The air we breathe out has got about 16% of oxygen. So we use that difference, if you like. So we draw air into our body. That air is quite high in oxygen, and because it's high in oxygen concentration, it's able to diffuse across into our blood. coming back, our muscles have created carbon dioxide as a byproduct of contraction, and that carbon dioxide travels in our blood up to our lungs, at which point it diffuses out of the blood into the lungs to be breathed out. So we'll look a little bit at that, about that process in a minute, and I'll sort of draw it as well. I think it's quite useful in your task to draw it. So let's go to that now. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. So to get there, we need to look at what alveoli are. So alveoli are little sacs at the end of bronchioles where gas exchange or diffusion takes place. So I'll talk through that their structure again in a minute. So diffusion is the movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So if we looked at something like, let's say you had a glass of water, and you know that's quite a, that is water. Let's say you've got a bottle of blackcurrant squash, so Ribena. So Ribena in the bottle as a concentrate is under very high concentration, isn't it? So what will happen if you pop that into the water is it disperses out. It goes from its high concentration to areas of low concentration. It kind of spreads out. Now, gas does a similar sort of thing. Where it's highly concentrated, it will move from that area of high concentration towards where it's in low concentration. So where we see this happening is areas like the alveoli here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just draw a little bit more on this picture, just to sort of emphasize that kind of process. So what we'll have, my internet's going a bit wonky. So let's imagine that my air, so these little red dots are oxygen. Now, what that means, what you see here, is the air that we've breathed in is in very high concentration. So what it will do, it will mean that essentially all that oxygen gets passed through that membrane. So if we think that it's almost like a driving pressure, so it means that the air molecules actually cross the membrane and are taken into the blood cells on the other side. So as long as the red blood cells have got a low concentration of oxygen, that oxygen will pass across that membrane. Now, if we can imagine that, let's say in that blood, it's got a high concentration of carbon dioxide. I'm trying to do it here. It's just sort of in a kind of a weirdly purple I'm doing here. So it's going to come back in various forms, a little bit in the blood cells, a little bit in the blood itself. But what that's going to do, where it's in a high concentration, that goes back into the alveoli to be breathed out. So oxygen diffuses across that membrane into the blood. Now, when you get round to the right side of that capillary, the carbon dioxide is now no longer in high concentration in that blood. So it's not going back into the alveoli. So the important thing is where things are in high concentration, i.e. alveoli oxygen, is transferred into that blood. The carbon dioxide, which has come back from the body, is in high concentration. So that is now being transferred into those alveoli. So what you can see is really a lot of this is driven by the fact, oh, it's gone all wonky. Let's just clear that off. So what you can see is that the alveoli at the bottom here are really covered by blood cells. So what you can see is that the blood vessels surround each alveoli. Oh yeah, sorry guys, I saw that I was breaking out. Am I back in now again? Is it better? I'll just take you through to another room, and then I'll sort of pause it and give you a bit of time to work. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm assuming we're back. So what we can see, hopefully you can see that. So what I was trying to get across was this concept of diffusion. So the idea of oxygen moving in high concentration inside the alveoli into the blood. And the way it's able to move into that blood is because if you look at that picture on the bottom right, you can see you can see that the alveoli are covered by these blood vessels. So one of the things that happens as we get fitter is actually we get more of these blood vessels surrounding our lungs. So it's quite a useful sort of adaptation for us. Okay, so I am going to give a little bit of a break for you as you're beginning to troll each other. So let me just scrub this off now. What I'm going to do is this. So let me just clear off my drawings. So that's pretty much it. So what we're going to do, we're going to grab a quick break. If we go break for 10 minutes, I'll sort of reset my Wi-Fi and try and get that sort of in order again. I'm going to give you a little task to write up the process of gas exchange, and then I'm going to get you set up on something for your employability as well. So let me just check the time. What time are we on now? So it's about 3:23. Can I get back in 10 minutes? If I get you back at 3:33, that would be brilliant. And then we'll finish this up nice and quick. Okay. So thank you very much. Green. So we were just talking about the concept of gas exchange and really the point that diffusion really drives it. So I'm just going to whiz through a couple of bits and pieces here. The things to draw your attention to here is that alveoli are thin. They allow gas to diffuse through into capillaries. They diffuse from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. In this picture, I don't know if it moves at all. No, it doesn't. What you see is from the left-hand side, that blue bit, this is deoxygenated blood. So this is sort of being used by the body. The oxygen has been extracted and kind of exchanged for carbon dioxide. So what we see here is deoxygenated blood sort of arriving at the alveoli. So this is a capillary that's sort of surrounding the alveoli, and oxygen is being transferred into that blood. So it kind of goes from that blue color here to a red. So it's becoming oxygenated. On the way back, so what we see in this slide is carbon dioxide leaving the bloodstream and going into the alveoli. So we see this when we look at the difference in composition between air that we breathe in and air that we breathe out. So let's just show you the main points. It's not wildly different in a way. So in the air that we breathe in, inhaled air, it's 21% oxygen, and in the air that we breathe out is, I think it's just slightly under 17%. So it sort of shows you that we extract around 4% of that oxygen the sort of, or there's a 4% difference in terms of the concentration of that oxygen. There's very little carbon dioxide in atmospheric air. So when we breathe in air, there's very little in it. The air that we breathe out is about 4% carbon dioxide. So that's been used. So the oxygen has been used by our body. Carbon dioxide has been breathed out, and that exhalation allows us to expel it into the atmosphere. So those are the main bits. Interestingly, you see that nitrogen is a really big part of air, and we don't normally absorb any of it. We can absorb it if you're deep sea diving. So when deep sea divers have to really monitor the time that they spend at very deep depths, because when they're very low down, let's say sort of 30-40 meters underwater, the pressure of that air is so great, it kind of forces its way into the body's tissues, and it starts to create all sorts of kind of crazy effects. They get this sort of this condition called nitrogen narcosis, where people start kind of going mad at the bottom of the sea. They start sort of sort of doing sort of somersaults and tumbling around and being silly, as their body becomes sort of toxic because of all this nitrogen being forced into it. But generally, we have this sort of fairly sort of standard 21% air we breathe in, around 17% air we breathe out. So that's allowed to get into our body through diffusion. Last couple of bits. So now what you're going to do then is this. So you're going to complete your task 2.6 in your workbook. Now, what it asks you to do, it asks you to describe the process of gaseous exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the lungs. Now, what I'd like you to do, I want you to complete it in your workbook, but I want you to start with the phrase that I've written on here. So I want you to start by saying air is drawn into the lungs, which contains a high concentration of oxygen. From there, you're going to explain how oxygen goes from the lungs into the blood and how carbon dioxide goes in the opposite direction. Now, what I would like you to do is try and use all of those words in that box on the right-hand side. So your job is to complete your answer by using all of those words. What I would suggest is you do a rough version now, and then finish up in a neat version once we've finished. Okay, but I'm going to give you about 7 or 8 minutes to have a crack at that now, if I could. If anyone wants to sort of give me their version and I can comment upon it, that's great. Otherwise, I'll let you crack on with it. Have a go at it, and then let me know if there's anything you're struggling with. Okay, so that's your job. Have a go at creating that explanation. So you're going to try and complete 2.6 in your workbook. If you're sort of struggling a little bit, just do a rough version to start with, and then refine it. If you're happy to do it straight into your workbook, by all means do. So you're describing the process of gas exchange, how oxygen comes into the body, carbon dioxide leaves it. But I want you to start with my lead-in phrase. So air is drawn into the lungs, which contains a high concentration of oxygen. So then you explain how oxygen gets across into the bloodstream, carbon dioxide goes the other way. Okay, so I'll start the clock ticking. I'll give you about 8 minutes to do that. So if you can get going on that now, that would be tremendous. Okay, hopefully you've managed to finish that. I've put a couple of ideas in to think of in the chat box as well, just so you can have a little think about them. So I've asked you to start it with my lead in, just so you kind of give a nice full answer, really. So I've asked you to say air is drawn into the lungs, which contains a high concentration of oxygen. Where air or where gas is in a high concentration, it would diffuse across a membrane into an area of low concentration. So oxygen in the alveoli is under high concentration, and that moves across the capillary wall into the bloodstream. So that's simple diffusion of oxygen into the bloodstream. Um, the blood that has returned from the body brings with it carbon dioxide in high concentration. So that diffuses, so passes across that membrane into the alveoli, where it's taken out and allowed to be exhaled. So hopefully you've got something that captures that. If not, there's a nice there's nice little explanations in your textbook which you can use to finish that up when you're finished. So what you should now have is a completed cardiovascular and a completed respiratory section of your anatomy unit. There's quite a lot to get through, but the more we sort of chip along, the better it is. So if you've got any gaps, one of your jobs this weekend is to complete that. So I'm going to very quickly just flick onto some stuff with employability. We've only got about 5 minutes, but I want to kind of give you a little task to do, to sort of to do over this sort of long weekend, or in 5 minutes time if you want to crack on with it. So let me just pass that over. So